At 69, she bought the house everyone feared. Then her dog heard footsteps no one could explain. The Victorian stood alone above Blackridge, its windows dark against the Oregon fog. For years, neighbors crossed the street rather than walk past it. Buyers came, looked around, and left. But after losing her husband and nearly everything familiar, Eleanor Whitaker wasn't looking for perfect. She was looking for somewhere to begin again. The first night inside, her German shepherd stopped at the foot of the stairs, ears raised toward the darkness above. Then came the sound neither of them expected. If your dog suddenly refused to climb those stairs, would you stay the night? Tell me what you'd do. The rain started before dawn, not a storm, just a steady Oregon rain that tapped softly against the windows and turned the world outside into a blur of gray. Eleanor Whitaker sat alone at her small kitchen table, wrapped in a faded blue cardigan she had owned for nearly 15 years. A mug of coffee rested between her hands. Steam curled upward, disappearing into the dim morning light. Across from her sat an empty chair. She looked at it without meaning to. After 2 years, she still did that. Some habits survived longer than grief. Harold had always occupied that chair. Every morning for 46 years, rain or sunshine, good days and bad ones. Now the chair remained exactly where it had always been. Only the man was gone. A soft sigh escaped her. At her feet, Ranger lifted his head. The German shepherd was stretched across the kitchen floor, his large paws crossed neatly in front of him. His ears twitched the moment he heard her breathe differently. "You don't miss much, do you?" Eleanor said quietly. Ranger's tail thumped once against the linoleum. The sound made her smile. Just a little. That dog had become the rhythm of her days. When she got up, he got up. When she sat down, he settled nearby. When she couldn't sleep, somehow he always knew. He never asked questions, never offered advice. He simply stayed, and sometimes that felt more valuable than words. Eleanor took another sip of coffee and glanced toward the stack of envelopes, sitting beside the sugar bowl. Bills, insurance statements, utility payments. The usual collection of reminders that life continued moving forward whether a person was ready or not. She picked up a small notebook and opened it. Numbers filled every page, careful numbers, pension income, savings, monthly expenses, property taxes, groceries, veterinary visits. The math never lied, and lately the math had become harder to ignore. The savings Harold and she had built over decades were shrinking. Not disappearing, not yet, but shrinking little by little, month after month, like water leaking from a bucket through a hole, too small to notice at first. The duplex she rented outside Eugene wasn't expensive by modern standards, but it wasn't hers. Every month she mailed a check for a place that carried none of her memories. Every month she felt a little less rooted, a little less certain. Outside, a delivery truck rolled past, spraying water from the road. Ranger stood and moved to the front window. He watched until the truck disappeared, then returned to her side, always checking, always making sure everything was as it should be. "You and me, huh?" Eleanor said, his ears perked. The answer was obvious. For now, it was just the two of them. Her son Michael lived less than 2 hours away, yet sometimes it felt like he lived on another continent. The distance between people wasn't measured in miles. She had learned that recently. The argument after Harold's death had changed things. At first, it had been small. Questions about finances, the estate, the house Eleanor and Harold had sold shortly before Harold became ill. Then came assumptions, resentments, things said during emotional moments that could never quite be taken back. Michael believed she should have handled certain decisions differently. Eleanor believed he had forgotten whose life those decisions belonged to. Neither had fully forgiven the other. Now their conversations were short, polite, careful, like strangers walking across thin ice. She hated that, more than she allowed herself to admit. The phone rang less often these days. The holidays felt quieter. Birthdays felt smaller. and some evenings stretched so long they seemed to lose track of time entirely. Around 10 o'clock the rain eased. A pale strip of sunlight appeared beneath the clouds. Eleanor gathered the empty coffee mug and washed it in the sink. Then she pulled on her jacket. Ranger was already waiting at the door. Of course he was. They followed the same walking route almost every morning. A narrow trail behind the duplex complex. Wet pine needles covered the ground. The air smelled of damp earth and cedar. Ranger moved confidently through the trees, stopping occasionally to investigate scents only he understood. Eleanor liked watching him. Dogs never worried about yesterday, never worried about next year. They simply occupied the moment they were given. The walk lasted nearly an hour. By the time they returned home, patches of blue sky had appeared overhead. The afternoon passed quietly. Laundry, cleaning, a grocery list. Small tasks that filled space without really filling time. Later, while Ranger slept near the couch, Eleanor sat at her laptop searching through local property listings. She wasn't entirely sure why. It had become a habit, a harmless one. Sometimes she looked at houses she could never afford. Sometimes she imagined different lives inside them. Most evenings she closed the browser after a few minutes. But that afternoon something caught her attention. A photograph. An old Victorian house perched on a hillside. White paint, steep roof, tall windows, a wraparound porch. The kind of house that belonged on a postcard. She clicked. The listing opened. Then she frowned. The price couldn't be right. She looked again. Still wrong, or at least it seemed wrong. The house was listed for less than many small homes in Eugene. Far less. She leaned closer to the screen. 2 stories, large lot, mountain views, original woodwork, nearly 3 acres. The numbers made no sense. Ranger opened one eye. She continued reading. Location: Blackridge, Oregon. The name sounded vaguely familiar. An old logging town northeast of Eugene. Population barely over 1,000. The photographs continued. Some showed obvious problems: peeling paint, broken gutters, overgrown landscaping, weather damage. Still, the property should have cost far more. Eleanor clicked through every image: living room, kitchen, porch, staircase, bedrooms. The place looked neglected, but not ruined. There was something about it, something difficult to explain. The feeling that beneath the neglect, someone had once cared deeply for it. She looked at the listing history. Her eyebrows rose. The property had been sitting unsold for years, not months, years. Price reduction stretched across multiple pages. That was unusual, very unusual. Curiosity got the better of her. She searched the address online. The results surprised her. Several local forum discussions mentioned the property. Old comments, local rumors. People seemed to know exactly which house it was, yet very few explained why. One comment simply read, "Nobody stays there." Another said, "Beautiful place, wrong house." A third added, "Locals know better." That was all. No details, no explanation, just fragments, the kind that lingered. Eleanor sat back in her chair. Ranger had wandered over and rested his head against her knee. "What do you think?" she asked. His tail swept across the carpet. The house remained on the screen, quiet, waiting. Outside, the clouds drifted apart, revealing a patch of late afternoon sunlight. For reasons she couldn't fully explain, Eleanor clicked the contact button. A simple form appeared. Name, phone number, email, request a showing. Her fingers hesitated above the keyboard. She looked around the duplex, the small rooms, the rented walls. The life that had slowly become smaller than she ever imagined. Then she looked back at the photograph of the Victorian house above Blackridge. Loneliness had a way of becoming familiar. Comfortable, even. Maybe that was the danger. Maybe one day you woke up and realized you had stopped expecting anything new. Eleanor filled in her information, then pressed send. The confirmation message appeared instantly, showing request received. A strange feeling settled over her. Not excitement. Not exactly. Something quieter, a cautious curiosity. The feeling of standing before a closed door and wondering what might be on the other side. Beside her, Ranger lifted his head and stared at the screen. The old house glowed softly in the photograph. Silent, distant, waiting. Neither of them knew it yet, but before long, both would be standing inside it. And nothing in Eleanor Whitaker's life would unfold the way she expected. 3 days after she submitted the request, her phone rang shortly after breakfast. The number was unfamiliar. Eleanor answered while standing at the kitchen counter, rinsing a coffee mug. Mrs. Whitaker? The voice belonged to a man, middle-aged, professional, slightly rushed. This is Daniel Reeves with Blackridge Realty. You requested a showing on the Mercer House. The Mercer House. For some reason, hearing the property called by a name made it feel more real. Yes, Eleanor said. Are you still interested? She glanced through the window. Ranger was stretched across the small patch of grass outside, watching a squirrel move along the fence line. I am. Daniel hesitated briefly. Not long enough to be obvious, but long enough to be noticeable. Would Saturday morning work? It would. Good. I'll meet you there at 10. The call ended. Simple as that. Yet for the rest of the week, Eleanor found herself thinking about the house more than she intended. She reviewed the listing several times, studied the photographs, zoomed in on details, a porch railing, an upstairs window, the shape of the roofline. She told herself it was merely curiosity, nothing more. After all, she hadn't even seen the property, and even if she liked it, there was no guarantee she could make the numbers work. Still, when Saturday arrived, she woke before sunrise, the same way she used to wake before family vacations decades ago. Not excitement exactly, anticipation. Outside, the morning was cool and clear. The previous week's rain had washed the air clean. Mist hung low over the fields beyond the highway. Ranger sensed something unusual almost immediately. The moment Eleanor retrieved her travel mug and car keys, he was at the door, alert, ready. His tail moved with controlled enthusiasm. You think we're going somewhere, don't you? His ears lifted. That was answer enough. The drive to Blackridge took nearly 90 minutes. The landscape changed gradually. Suburbs gave way to farmland. Farmland gave way to forest. Tall Douglas firs crowded the roadside. The highway narrowed. The towns became smaller, older. The farther they drove, the more it felt as though they were traveling backward through time. By the time Eleanor passed the weathered sign welcoming visitors to Blackridge, she understood why the town had once depended on logging. The forests seemed endless. The town itself sat in a shallow valley surrounded by dark green hills. Many buildings looked decades old. Some storefronts were occupied. Others stood empty. A diner, a hardware store, a gas station. A small church with white siding, nothing flashy, nothing new. Just a place that had learned how to endure. Daniel Reeves was waiting beside a silver pickup truck near the edge of town. He appeared to be in his late 50s, neatly dressed, friendly enough. The kind of realtor who spent more time handling rural properties than suburban developments. After brief introductions, he climbed into his truck. Just follow me. The road out of town began climbing almost immediately. It wound through dense forest, around sharp curves, past old logging roads that disappeared into the trees. Then, after nearly 10 minutes, the forest opened, and Eleanor saw it. The house stood alone on a hillside overlooking the valley below. For several seconds, she simply stared. The photographs hadn't prepared her. Not really. The structure was larger than it appeared online. A Victorian built during another era. Its steep roof lines reached toward the sky. Tall windows reflected drifting clouds. A wide porch wrapped around the front. Even neglected, it possessed a certain dignity, like an aging woman wearing a faded dress she once loved. The driveway was cracked. Grass pushed through sections of old pavement. Weeds crowded the stone walkway. Several porch boards needed replacing. Paint peeled from the exterior in long curling strips. Yet none of that was what Eleanor noticed first. What she noticed was the feeling. The house seemed oddly quiet, not abandoned, not empty, just waiting. Daniel must have seen her expression. Most people have the same reaction. What reaction? He smiled. They either love it immediately or want to leave within 5 minutes. Eleanor looked at him. Which one am I? I haven't figured that out yet. He unlocked the front door. The hinges groaned softly. Cool air drifted out. The smell hit her first. Old wood, dust, cedar, faint traces of smoke. The scent of decades layered on top of one another. She stepped inside. The entry hall was dim despite the morning sunlight. Dust floated through thin beams of light near the windows. A staircase curved upward toward the second floor. To the left sat a large living room. To the right, a formal dining room. The wallpaper had faded. The hardwood floors showed wear. Water stains marked sections of the ceiling. Yet beneath the neglect, Eleanor immediately recognized quality. The woodwork around the doors, the carved banister, the built-in cabinets. Someone had cared about details when this place was built. She walked slowly, running her fingers across smooth sections of oak railing, studying stained glass accents near the front windows, imagining what the house might have looked like 50 years earlier. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't thinking about bills, or loneliness, or Michael. She was simply looking, exploring. Meanwhile, Ranger remained unusually quiet. The German Shepherd moved through the foyer, past the living room, past the dining room. His nose worked constantly, evaluating unfamiliar scents. Then he stopped completely. Eleanor noticed immediately. Ranger wasn't a nervous dog. He wasn't prone to strange behavior. Yet now he stood at the foot of the staircase, motionless. His ears pointed forward. Every muscle seemed focused on something above, the second-floor landing. Eleanor? Daniel's voice sounded distant. She looked back at Ranger. The dog didn't move. Come on, boy. Nothing. His eyes remained fixed upstairs. She walked toward him, placed a hand on his shoulder. The muscles beneath his coat felt tense. Not frightened, alert, very alert. You okay? Ranger finally looked at her. Then looked back toward the landing, as though making sure she noticed it too. Daniel approached. Everything all right? I think so. Ranger took one cautious step toward the staircase, then stopped again. His body stiffened. A low uncertainty, not quite a growl, not quite a whine, escaped his throat. Eleanor had never heard that sound before. She tried encouraging him upward. Nothing worked. Treats, commands, patience. The German Shepherd refused. Not aggressively, not dramatically, simply absolutely. The stairs might as well have been a wall. Eventually, Eleanor climbed alone. The second floor contained 4 bedrooms and a long hallway. Dust coated the floorboards. Sunlight filtered through aging curtains. Nothing appeared unusual. Nothing appeared threatening. Yet when she looked down toward the foyer, Ranger was still waiting below, watching, listening, not willing to join her. The sight left a faint knot in her stomach. By the time the tour ended, nearly 2 hours had passed. Daniel locked the front door behind them. Neither spoke immediately. The valley stretched below the hillside. Cloud shadows drifted across distant forests. Finally, Eleanor asked the question, "Why has it been sitting so long?" Daniel exhaled, the way someone does when they've answered the same question many times. Honestly? Please, people buy it. He paused. Or try to. What does that mean? A few have made offers. One family actually moved in years ago. What happened? Daniel shrugged. They left. Why? Different reasons depending on who you ask. That answer wasn't really an answer. Both of them knew it. Eleanor looked back toward the house. The tall windows reflected the sky. Nobody ever tells the whole story? Not that I've heard. He hesitated. Blackridge is a small town. People talk. Sometimes they don't know what they're talking about. And yet nobody stays. No. The drive home felt shorter. Ranger slept in the back seat, or at least pretended to. But several times Eleanor caught him awake, watching the passing trees through the window, thinking, at least that's what it looked like. The following week became a blur of calculations. Bank meetings, phone calls, financial records, sleepless nights. The house cost more than she wanted to spend, less than it should, and almost everything she had. Several times she decided against it. Several times she reopened the paperwork. Something kept pulling her back. Not the mystery, not the rumors. The feeling she experienced standing inside those rooms. The feeling that beneath the damage and neglect, the house still had something left to give. On Thursday afternoon, she signed the papers. On Friday morning, the transfer was completed. By Friday evening, she officially owned the house on the hill above Blackridge. Nearly all of her remaining savings were gone. The decision terrified her. It also felt strangely right. That night, she sat alone in the duplex, Ranger resting beside her chair. The signed documents lay on the table. The future felt uncertain, larger than it had in years. Outside, darkness settled over Oregon. Far away, above a forgotten logging town, an old Victorian house waited quietly on its hillside. And soon, for the first time in a very long time, someone would be living there again. The move took place 2 weeks later. Eleanor did not own enough furniture to justify hiring movers. By the time Harold passed away and she downsized into the duplex, most of what they had accumulated over 4 decades was already gone. Some had been sold, some donated, some left behind because life had become too complicated to carry everything forward. What remained fit into a rented trailer: a bed, a dining table, 2 chairs, boxes of books, kitchen supplies, family photographs, and Ranger's belongings. The German Shepherd seemed to understand that something important was happening. He followed Eleanor from room to room while she packed, watched every box being sealed, every picture removed from the wall, every drawer emptied. When the final morning arrived, she stood alone in the duplex living room. The space echoed slightly now. Empty, temporary, like a hotel room after checkout. For a moment she felt uncertain, not about the house, about herself. Starting over sounded brave when people talked about it. In reality, it mostly felt exhausting. At 69 years old, most people were trying to simplify their lives. She was hauling hers up a mountain. Ranger pressed against her leg. The familiar weight grounded her. "Okay," she said softly. "Let's go." The drive to Blackridge felt different this time. Less like a visit, more like crossing a border. The weather had changed since her first trip. Summer was beginning to surrender to autumn. Patches of gold appeared among the trees. The air carried the faint scent of wood smoke. By early afternoon, she pulled into the cracked driveway of the Victorian house. The structure looked exactly as she remembered. Tall, silent, weathered, watching over the valley below. For several seconds, she remained behind the wheel. Then she took a deep breath and stepped out. The first few days disappeared into work. Every room needed attention. Dust coated nearly every surface. Dead insects filled window tracks. Several cabinet doors hung crooked on aging hinges. The kitchen sink leaked. One upstairs window refused to close completely. There was always something, always another task. Yet strangely, Eleanor found herself enjoying it. Not the repairs, the purpose. Each morning she woke with a list. Each evening she crossed something off. For the first time in years, she felt useful again. The house demanded her attention, and somehow that felt healthier than sitting alone thinking about the things she could not change. Ranger adapted quickly. During daylight hours, he explored every corner of the property: the backyard, the overgrown garden, the tree line beyond the porch, the hillside overlooking town. Occasionally, Eleanor would look up from her work and find him standing motionless, staring across the valley as if guarding the entire mountain. The townspeople began noticing her. Blackridge was not large enough for anonymity. Within a week, she recognized several faces. The woman who worked at the grocery store, the elderly man who owned the hardware shop, the teenager at the gas station. Everyone seemed polite, friendly even. But occasionally she would catch a certain expression when they learned where she lived. A pause, a glance. Something left unsaid. Then the conversation would move on. The first strange incident happened 11 days after she moved in. It was nearly sunset. The sky outside had turned orange and lavender. Eleanor sat in the living room, sorting through a box of old photographs, while Ranger slept near the fireplace. The house was quiet, completely quiet. Then Ranger lifted his head. Instantly, as though someone had called his name. His ears stood upright. Every muscle became alert. Eleanor noticed immediately. "What is it?" Ranger did not respond. He rose slowly, turned toward the staircase, and stared. The same staircase. The same landing. The same place that had unsettled him during the first visit. For nearly a minute he remained frozen, listening. Then just as suddenly, whatever had captured his attention seemed to disappear. He relaxed, lay back down, and closed his eyes. Eleanor frowned. The behavior bothered her, but not enough to dwell on it. Old houses made noises. Animals heard things people didn't. That was all. Or so she told herself. The next evening it happened again. Same time, same reaction. This time Ranger stood longer, his gaze fixed on the darkness above. His ears rotated slightly, following something, tracking something. Yet Eleanor heard nothing. No footsteps, no voices, nothing at all. By the fourth occurrence she began paying attention. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Always shortly after sunset. Always focused on the second floor. Always ending after a minute or two. She climbed upstairs several times, checked each room, opened closets, inspected windows, found nothing. No sign of intrusion, no sign of animals, no explanation. Then came the night everything changed. A storm rolled across the valley just after dusk. Wind rattled branches against the house. Rain tapped against the windows. The temperature dropped sharply. Eleanor sat at the dining room table, balancing receipts and invoices from recent repairs. Ranger rested nearby. The grandfather clock in the hallway marked the passage of time with slow mechanical ticks. Outside, thunder rumbled far away. Then Ranger stood. Not gradually, immediately. His head snapped upward, his ears locked forward. A low sound emerged from deep into his chest. Not a bark, not a growl. A warning. Eleanor felt her stomach tighten. The dog never behaved this way. Never. "What is it, Ranger?" He moved toward the staircase, slowly, carefully, every step deliberate. The fur along his shoulders stood slightly raised. Eleanor pushed back her chair. The house seemed suddenly very still. The storm outside faded into the background. For several seconds nothing happened. Then she heard it. A sound. Faint. Above her. One step. A floorboard creaked, then another. Slow, measured, as though someone was walking across the upstairs hallway. Eleanor froze. Her first thought was simple. Someone was inside the house. The footsteps continued. 3, 4, 5. Not running, not sneaking. Walking steadily. The sound carried clearly through the ceiling. Ranger stared upward, his entire body rigid. The footsteps stopped. Silence returned. Eleanor's pulse hammered in her ears. For a moment she simply stood there, listening, waiting, nothing. Finally she grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer. "Stay close." Ranger needed no encouragement. Together they approached the staircase. The old wood groaned beneath their weight. One step, then another. The beam of light swept across the landing. The hallway stretched ahead, empty. The doors remained exactly where she remembered, closed, silent, no movement. No voices, no intruder. She checked every room, one by one. The larger bedroom, the smaller bedroom, the bathroom, the storage closet. Nothing. No open windows, no muddy footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. By the time she returned downstairs, the storm had intensified. Rain hammered against the roof. Thunder echoed through the valley. Ranger remained uneasy for the rest of the night. He refused to settle completely. Every so often he lifted his head and listened, watching the staircase, waiting. Eleanor slept poorly. Not because she believed in ghosts, she didn't. Not because she thought the house was haunted. That seemed ridiculous. But she knew what she had heard. The footsteps had sounded real. Too real. The following evening she listened carefully. Nothing happened. The evening after that, however, the footsteps returned. Again shortly after sunset. Again upstairs. Again disappearing before she could reach the hallway. The pattern continued. Not every night, but often enough. Always the same. Always brief. Always impossible to explain. And every single time Ranger heard them first, long before Eleanor did. One evening she found herself standing at the foot of the staircase beside him. Both staring upward. Both listening. The house seemed to be holding its breath. Somewhere above them, hidden behind old walls and aging wood, a floorboard creaked softly. Then another. Ranger's ears twitched. Eleanor felt a chill move across the back of her neck. For the first time since buying the house, she found herself wondering whether the people in town had been avoiding more than just an old building. And for the first time, she began to suspect that whatever had driven others away might still be here, waiting, listening, just beyond sight. That was the feeling that stayed with Eleanor over the next several days. The footsteps continued. Not every night, not on any schedule she could predict, but often enough that she stopped questioning whether she had imagined them. She hadn't. Neither had Ranger. The German shepherd always knew first. Always. Sometimes he would be asleep beside the fireplace, breathing deeply, completely relaxed. Then his head would lift, his ears would turn toward the staircase, and within seconds the sound would come. A slow creak, a measured step, another, then silence. The pattern never changed. By the second week, Eleanor found herself structuring her evenings around it, listening, waiting, watching Ranger, watching the stairs. The uncertainty was beginning to wear on her, not because she believed something supernatural was happening. She didn't. At least she didn't think she did, but she needed an explanation. Human beings could tolerate many things: fear, loss, loneliness. What they struggled to tolerate was uncertainty. And uncertainty had taken up residence in the house. One cool October morning, Eleanor decided she needed answers from someone who knew Blackridge better than she did. The town was waking up as she drove down the hill. A delivery truck unloaded produce behind the grocery store. A pair of loggers stood outside the diner, holding paper coffee cups. The scent of bacon drifted through the chilly air. Blackridge looked peaceful, ordinary, the kind of place where everybody knew everybody, which made the silence surrounding her house even stranger. She stopped first at the diner. The waitress recognized her immediately. "Morning, Mrs. Whitaker." "Morning." She ordered coffee and scrambled eggs. Nothing fancy, the kind of breakfast Harold used to call honest food. As she ate, she casually brought up the house. The Mercer place. The reaction was immediate, not dramatic, subtle. The waitress paused for half a second longer than necessary while refilling a coffee cup. A man at the counter glanced in her direction. Another customer looked away. The shift was small, but impossible to miss. "You live up there now, right?" the waitress asked. "I do. How are you liking it?" Still deciding, a faint smile, then silence. The conversation died. Nobody volunteered anything else. Nobody asked questions. By the time Eleanor paid her bill, she knew no more than when she arrived. Outside, she stood beside her car for a moment, watching people move along Main Street. Everybody seemed friendly. Yet somehow the house sat behind an invisible wall. People acknowledged it, then immediately retreated. The next stop was the hardware store. An older man named Frank worked behind the counter. He had the weathered face of someone who had spent most of his life outdoors. When Eleanor mentioned the Mercer house, he frowned. Not suspiciously. More like someone hearing an old song he hadn't thought about in years. "That's a fine old place," he said. "People don't seem to think so." Frank shrugged. "People think all kinds of things. You know why nobody stays there?" He looked toward the front window. "Not really." The answer came too quickly. Eleanor noticed. Frank noticed that she noticed. But neither said anything. By lunchtime, she had spoken to 6 different people. Every conversation ended the same way, polite, vague, incomplete. It was as if the entire town had agreed never to discuss the subject openly. That evening she sat on her porch with Ranger lying beside her. The valley below glowed gold beneath the setting sun. Wind moved softly through the trees. The beauty of the place made the mystery feel even stranger. Why avoid talking about it? Why not simply tell her what they knew? Ranger suddenly stood. His attention shifted downhill. A truck was approaching. An older blue pickup climbed the driveway slowly and stopped near the house. The driver remained seated for a moment, then climbed out. He looked to be well into his 80s, thin, tall. A plaid jacket hanging loosely from narrow shoulders. His white hair was neatly combed. His movements carried the careful pace of age. But there was strength in them, too. The strength of someone who had spent a lifetime working with his hands. The man removed his cap. "You must be Eleanor Whitaker." She stood. "I am." He nodded toward the house. Names, Walter Griggs. Something about the name sounded familiar. Then she remembered. The cashier at the grocery store had mentioned him several days earlier. Retired carpenter, born in Blackridge, knew every building in town. Walter looked up at the Victorian. His eyes lingered on the porch railing. The windows, the roofline, the details. Not the way a visitor would, the way a craftsman would. "I helped repair this place years ago," he said quietly, "when Leonard Mercer still lived here." The name immediately caught Eleanor's attention. Leonard Mercer. For the first time, someone was willing to discuss the man who had owned the house. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked. Walter smiled. Never say no to coffee. They sat on the porch while daylight slowly faded. Ranger settled beside Eleanor's chair, though the dog never completely relaxed. His attention kept drifting toward the front door, toward the staircase inside. Walter wrapped both hands around the mug. For several minutes he simply looked out across the valley. Then he spoke. "Leonard Mercer wasn't what people say he was." "What do people say he was?" Walter snorted softly. "A recluse, a stubborn old fool, a man who couldn't let things go." "And what was he?" "A school principal." Walter stared toward the distant tree line. "A good one." The answer surprised her. "He ran the elementary school here for years. Tough when he needed to be. Fair most of the time." "What happened to him?" Walter was silent, long enough for Eleanor to think he might not answer. Finally he sighed. "Depends who you ask." "What does that mean?" "Officially." Walter took a sip of coffee. "Officially, Leonard packed up and left town about 30 years ago." "And unofficially?" Walter's gaze shifted toward the house behind them. His expression changed slightly. Not fear, not exactly. Something closer to uncertainty. "I never believed it." The evening seemed suddenly quieter. Even the wind had faded. Eleanor leaned forward. "You think something happened to him?" Walter shook his head. "I don't know what happened, but you don't believe he left." "No." The answer came without hesitation. "Why?" Walter stared into his coffee. "Because Leonard loved this place." His eyes moved toward the upstairs windows. He wasn't the sort of man who walked away from things. A chill touched the back of Eleanor's neck, not because of what Walter said, because of how certain he sounded. As darkness settled across the hillside, Walter eventually stood to leave. At the truck he paused. "There's something else?" Walter looked toward the house one last time, then toward Ranger. The German Shepherd was staring at the second-floor windows, completely focused, completely still, Walter noticed. "So he's doing it too." Eleanor frowned. "Doing what?" Walter didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked back toward the house, toward the upstairs level, toward the darkness gathering behind the windows. Then he said quietly, listening. A few minutes later, he drove away. That night, the footsteps returned. Shortly after sunset, Ranger rose from the living room floor, walked upstairs without being asked, and stopped outside one specific bedroom door. He sat there, watching, waiting, listening, and for the first time, he refused to come back down. Eleanor stood at the bottom of the staircase, staring upward. The hallway light cast a pale yellow glow across the second-floor landing. Ranger sat motionless near the far end of the hall. Outside a closed bedroom door, the same bedroom. His attention never wavered. Eleanor sighed. "Come on, boy." Nothing. The German shepherd didn't even look at her. That alone unsettled her. Ranger had always been obedient. Not perfect. No dog was. But he trusted her completely. If she called him, he came. If she asked him to leave something alone, he usually did. Tonight was different. Slowly, she climbed the stairs. The old wood creaked beneath her feet. The house felt strangely quiet, as though it too were listening. When she reached the hallway, Ranger finally glanced at her. Then immediately returned his focus to the bedroom door. The room itself looked ordinary. A guest bedroom. Small compared to the master bedroom. One window facing the valley. An iron bed frame covered by an old dust sheet. A dresser in the corner. Nothing unusual. Nothing threatening. Yet Ranger remained fixed on it. Eleanor opened the door. The hinges groaned softly. The room smelled like old paper and cedar. Dust floated through the beam of light from the hallway. She stepped inside. Ranger followed. For several minutes they searched together, closet, window. Under the bed, nothing. No signs of animals, no signs of intrusion, no hidden person. Eventually, Eleanor convinced herself she was chasing shadows. She returned downstairs. Ranger followed reluctantly. But before settling near the fireplace, he looked back toward the staircase one final time, as though memorizing it. That night the footsteps returned. Not loud, not dramatic, just clear enough. 3 slow creaks overhead, then silence. Eleanor barely slept. The next morning dawned gray and cold. Fog drifted through the valley below the house. The trees appeared and disappeared in shifting layers of white mist. Eleanor sat with her coffee at the kitchen table. Ranger rested nearby. His eyes occasionally drifted toward the stairs. The behavior was becoming impossible to ignore. So was Walter's comment. Listening, the words stayed with her. By mid-morning she made a decision. If answers existed, they would be inside the house, not in rumors, not in speculation. Inside, she began exploring more carefully than before, not cleaning, investigating. The process consumed the next several days. She examined closets, opened cabinets, checked attic access panels, read old labels left behind in drawers. The house slowly revealed pieces of its history. Most were ordinary, old receipts, forgotten Christmas decorations, a cracked picture frame, evidence that people had once lived normal lives here. Yet nothing explained Leonard Mercer. Nothing explained the footsteps. Nothing explained Ranger's fixation on that bedroom. Then came the storm. The strongest storm since she moved in. Rain arrived just after sunset. Heavy, persistent. Wind pushed against the windows hard enough to rattle the glass. Tree branches scraped the roof. Thunder rolled through the mountains. The entire house seemed alive with sound. Eleanor sat reading in the living room while Ranger slept nearby. The grandfather clock ticked steadily in the hallway. Outside, rain hammered the porch roof. Then Ranger exploded to his feet. Not startled, driven. His ears shot upward, his body locked onto something. A second later, the footsteps came, louder than ever before, above them, moving across the second-floor hallway. One step, another, slow, heavy, deliberate, as though someone was walking directly over their heads. The sound lasted longer than usual, much longer. Ranger bolted. For the first time since moving into the house, he raced upstairs without hesitation. His nails hammered across the wooden steps. "Eleanor!" She jumped to her feet and followed. By the time she reached the landing, Ranger was already at the bedroom door, scratching furiously. The dog had never behaved this way. Never. His paws struck the wood repeatedly. His breathing was rapid, his entire body focused on one thing. Getting inside, the footsteps stopped. Silence crashed into the hallway. Only the storm remained. Rain, wind, thunder. Eleanor opened the door. Ranger rushed inside. The bedroom looked exactly the same. Nothing moved. Nothing changed. Yet Ranger continued searching, back and forth, sniffing, circling, returning repeatedly to one specific wall. The wall behind an antique wardrobe. Eleanor watched him. The wardrobe stood against the far side of the room, tall, heavy, made of dark oak. She had barely paid attention to it before. The dog pressed his nose against the floor near its base, then looked at her, then back at the wardrobe, then at her again. A simple message, "Look here." Thunder flashed outside. The room brightened briefly, then darkened again. Eleanor moved closer. At first she saw nothing, just old wood, dust, wallpaper. Then she noticed something odd. The floorboards near the wardrobe showed faint scrape marks, parallel lines, almost hidden beneath decades of wear. The kind created when heavy furniture had been moved repeatedly. A cold feeling settled into her chest. Slowly she placed both hands against the wardrobe and pushed. The furniture resisted, then shifted, just slightly. Dust spilled from behind it. Ranger immediately moved closer, his tail rigid, his eyes fixed. Eleanor pushed again. The wardrobe slid several inches. Enough to expose the wall behind it. For several seconds she simply stared. The wallpaper pattern didn't match. The floral design aligned perfectly across every wall in the room. Except here, a narrow section, roughly 3 feet wide, interrupted the pattern. Most people would never notice. She probably wouldn't have either. Not without Ranger. The storm roared outside. Rain hammered the glass. Her heartbeat quickened. Carefully she brushed away dust. The edge of a hidden seam appeared. Then another, a concealed door, built directly into the wall. For a long moment Eleanor couldn't move. The house suddenly felt different. Not haunted, not cursed. Intentional. Someone had hidden this. Someone wanted it forgotten. Ranger stood beside her, waiting. The concealed latch took several minutes to find. An old brass mechanism hidden behind decorative trim. When she finally pressed it, a soft click echoed through the room. The hidden door shifted inward. A breath of stale air escaped, cold, dry, undisturbed. Eleanor reached for her flashlight. The beam cut through darkness. A narrow compartment stretched beyond the wall. Not large, perhaps 8 feet deep, just enough space for shelves. Storage, secrets. Her pulse pounded. Slowly she stepped inside. Dust covered everything. Thick layers untouched for years. Yet the contents remained intact. Shelves lined the walls. Boxes, folders, bound journals, photographs, property maps, file envelopes tied with fading string. The smell reminded her of old libraries. Paper, ink, time. Ranger entered behind her. His alertness changed immediately. The tension left his body. The frantic energy vanished. For the first time in weeks, he seemed calm, as though he had finally found what he had been searching for. Eleanor knelt beside the nearest shelf. Her flashlight illuminated a stack of journals, leather-bound, carefully labeled. Each one carried the same name, Leonard Mercer. She stared at the handwriting, real, personal, undeniable. Nearby sat dozens of photographs, newspaper clippings, property records, several sealed envelopes addressed to no one. The hidden room wasn't random storage. It was an archive, a collection, a record of something. Outside, thunder rolled across the valley. Inside, Eleanor felt the entire mystery shift beneath her feet. The footsteps, the house, the silence from the townspeople. Walter's certainty that Leonard never left. For weeks she had been chasing questions. Now she stood inside the first real answer. The mystery wasn't her imagination. It wasn't a loose floorboard. It wasn't an old house settling at night. Someone had hidden part of this house, deliberately, carefully. And whatever Leonard Mercer had wanted preserved was now sitting on these shelves, waiting, just as the house had been waiting for someone to finally find it. The storm continued well past midnight. Rain lashed against the windows. Wind moved through the trees surrounding the house. Yet Eleanor barely noticed any of it. She remained inside the hidden compartment for nearly an hour, flashlight in hand. Ranger lying quietly beside her feet. The shelves were packed more densely than she had first realized. Years of records, Years of notes, years of someone's life preserved in silence. Leonard Mercer had not thrown things into this space. He had organized them, carefully, methodically. Every journal was labeled by year. Every file folder carried dates. Photographs had been grouped into envelopes. Maps were rolled and tied with twine. The hidden room felt less like storage and more like evidence. Evidence of something Leonard had desperately wanted preserved. Eventually, Eleanor carried several journals downstairs. She set them on the dining room table, made tea, then began reading. The first entries surprised her. They weren't dramatic. They weren't the writings of an eccentric recluse. They were practical observations, community events, school board meetings, weather records, notes about local families, mentions of students he had taught. The voice that emerged from the pages felt thoughtful, patient, sometimes humorous, very human. Not at all like the strange figure people seemed to remember. Hours passed. Outside, the storm faded. Inside the house, the silence deepened. By 2 in the morning, Eleanor had read nearly 3 years of entries. One realization became impossible to ignore. Walter had been right. The Leonard Mercer described in these journals was not a man who would simply disappear. The deeper she read, the more obvious it became. He loved Blackridge, not in a sentimental way, in the way people love places they invest themselves in. He knew the names of families, remembered birthdays, tracked school graduations, worried about local businesses, celebrated when someone recovered from illness, mourned when someone passed away. Again and again, his entries returned to one idea. Community mattered. People mattered. It didn't fit the story of a bitter old man walking away without explanation. Around 3 in the morning, Eleanor finally went to bed. For the first time in weeks, Ranger did not position himself facing the staircase. Instead, he slept beside her bedroom door, calm, relaxed. The change was impossible to miss. Almost as though discovering the hidden room had resolved something for him. The next morning, she awoke exhausted but determined. Coffee helped, so did sunlight. The storm had cleared completely. Blue skies stretched across the valley. The forests surrounding Blackridge shimmered with moisture. Everything looked freshly washed. Eleanor carried another stack of journals onto the porch. Ranger settled nearby. The dog seemed happier than he had since arriving at the house. More settled, less watchful. As the hours passed, Leonard's writings began to change. Subtly at first, then dramatically. The shift appeared about 5 years before his disappearance. Names started appearing repeatedly. Companies, property transactions, meetings, land surveys, timber contracts. The entries became longer, more detailed, more concerned. Eleanor found herself reading more slowly. One journal entry stopped her cold. October 12th. People think nobody notices because they assume age makes a person invisible. They mistake observation for weakness. She reread the sentence twice. Something about it struck deeply, not because of Leonard, because of herself. She understood exactly what he meant. Since Harold's death, she had experienced it often. People speaking around her instead of to her. People assuming she wouldn't understand financial matters. People explaining simple things as though she were a child. Even Michael, during their arguments over the estate, had spoken with a tone she barely recognized, as if her role was simply to agree. Leonard had felt it too. That realization unsettled her. The parallels continued. Over the next several days, she read steadily. Every evening, every morning, every spare moment. The journals revealed a man becoming increasingly concerned about something happening in Blackridge. A timber company. Cascade Ridge Timber. The name appeared repeatedly, at first only occasionally, then constantly. Leonard documented unusual property purchases. Land changing hands through intermediaries. Surveys that didn't match earlier records. Meetings between company representatives and local officials. The entries grew more cautious, more investigative, almost as if Leonard had become an amateur journalist or a detective. One passage stood out more than any other. March 7. They assume nobody keeps records anymore. That memory disappears when paperwork changes. They underestimate how many documents remain in filing cabinets if someone is patient enough to look. Eleanor closed the journal. A breeze moved through the porch. Below, Blackridge sat quietly beneath the afternoon sun. The town looked peaceful, ordinary. Yet Leonard had clearly believed something significant was happening beneath the surface. Something important enough to document. Something important enough to hide. That evening she drove to town. Not for groceries, not for supplies, for Walter. She found him repairing a fence behind a modest house near the edge of town. The old carpenter seemed unsurprised to see her. "Found something, didn't you?" Eleanor laughed softly. "Was it that obvious?" Walter set down his hammer. "You've got the same look Leonard used to get." That answer immediately caught her attention. What look? The look of somebody who's found a thread and intends to keep pulling. They sat beneath a large maple tree. Autumn leaves scattered across the grass around them. Eleanor told him about the journals. Not everything, just enough. Walter listened quietly, occasionally nodding. When she mentioned Cascade Ridge timber, his expression changed. Not fear, recognition. "You remember them?" Walter nodded. "Everybody remembers them. What happened?" The old man looked toward the mountains. "Depends how far back you want to go. Start wherever makes sense." Walter folded his hands. 30 years ago, logging was changing. Smaller operations were disappearing. Bigger companies were buying everything they could. He paused. Some folks got rich, and others, they got pushed aside. The answer hung in the air. Simple, heavy, real. Walter continued. Leonard started asking questions, a lot of questions. What kind? Property records, boundary changes, land transfers. His eyes narrowed slightly. He believed some people were making decisions that benefited themselves more than the town. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken. Was he right? Walter shrugged. I never saw proof. But Leonard wasn't the kind of man who imagined things. The afternoon light softened around them. For several moments, neither spoke. Finally, Eleanor asked the question that had been growing inside her since discovering the journals. What do you think happened to him? Walter took a long time answering, long enough that she wondered if he would. At last he spoke quietly. I think he got too close to something. The words settled between them, neither dramatic nor sensational, just honest, and somehow that made them more unsettling. Driving home, Eleanor replayed the conversation repeatedly. The pieces were beginning to connect, not fully, but enough to form a shape. The town remembered Leonard incorrectly, or perhaps conveniently. The hidden room proved he had been documenting something. The journals proved he had concerns. The abrupt ending of those journals suggested something interrupted his work. By the time she reached the house, dusk had arrived. The Victorian stood against the fading sky. Its windows reflected the last light of day. Ranger greeted her at the front door, tail wagging once, then twice. Inside, the familiar scent of cedar and old wood welcomed her. The house felt different now, not frightening, not mysterious in the same way. It felt inhabited by a story someone had tried very hard to preserve. Later that evening, Eleanor returned to the journals, one of the final volumes. The entries near the end became increasingly urgent. References to missing files, disappearing records, people refusing to answer questions. Then, near the final pages, she found a sentence that made her sit upright. If anything happens to me, the truth remains with the property. The handwriting looked darker, more forceful, as though Leonard had pressed harder while writing it. Beneath the sentence was a list of dates, survey references, parcel numbers, coordinates. Information Eleanor didn't yet understand, but she knew one thing. Leonard Mercer hadn't been hiding memories. He had been protecting something, and whatever it was, he believed it was important enough to risk everything for. The journal ended only 3 weeks later, abruptly. No farewell, no explanation, No final entry, just silence, the kind of silence that leaves questions behind. Outside, darkness settled over the hillside. The grandfather clock ticked steadily in the hallway. Ranger slept peacefully near the fireplace. And for the first time since moving into the house, Eleanor no longer felt like she was investigating a mystery. She felt like she had inherited one. The journal remained open on the dining room table long after midnight. The grandfather clock marked each passing hour. Tick, tick. Ranger slept near the fireplace. The house settled quietly around them. But Eleanor couldn't stop staring at the final page. Parcel numbers, survey references, coordinates. The entries looked mundane, the kind of information most people would skip over without a second thought. Yet Leonard Mercer had hidden them, protected them, preserved them, and he had written one final warning beside them. The truth remains with the property, not with the town, not with the people, with the property. The wording bothered her, because it sounded deliberate, specific, as if Leonard believed the land itself contained something important. The next morning, she drove to Blackridge's small public library. The building occupied an old brick structure near Main Street. Inside, the smell of paper and polished wood immediately reminded her of school buildings from decades earlier. A librarian named Sandra helped her locate archived county maps and historical land records. Most were stored on microfilm. Others existed only as fading paper copies. The process took hours. Eleanor moved slowly, patiently, cross-checking information from Leonard's journals against public records. At first, she found nothing unusual. Then, shortly after lunch, she noticed a discrepancy. A small one, easy to miss. The kind of mistake people overlooked because they assumed someone else had already checked it. A property boundary from 30 years earlier did not match a newer county map. The difference appeared minor, just a few lines, a slight adjustment, nothing dramatic. Yet the more she compared records, the stranger it became. The older survey and the newer survey described different acreage. She checked again, then again. The numbers still didn't match. By late afternoon, she copied everything and drove directly to Walter Grigg's house. The old carpenter studied the papers beneath his reading glasses. His brow slowly furrowed. That single sound was enough to raise Eleanor's pulse. What? Walter looked up. I remember this survey. You do? Leonard showed it to me years ago. He tapped the page. Same map. Eleanor sat forward. What was wrong with it? Walter frowned. At the time, nothing. His finger moved across the property line. But this, he pointed to the newer record. This wasn't here. What wasn't? The adjustment. Silence settled between them. Walter looked troubled, not frightened, confused, as though reality had quietly shifted while nobody was paying attention. You think it was a mistake? Walter leaned back. I think you need somebody who understands surveys better than I do. The answer stayed with Eleanor during the drive home. That evening she made several phone calls. Most went nowhere. Eventually, one local official recommended a surveyor from Eugene named David Hollister. David specialized in historical property disputes. 2 weeks later, he arrived at the Victorian house, carrying measuring equipment and several large map tubes. He appeared to be in his early 50s, practical, methodical, not particularly interested in rumors. Exactly the kind of person Eleanor trusted. The weather was cool and clear. Autumn had deepened across the valley. Orange and gold leaves covered sections of the hillside. The forests surrounding Blackridge looked almost painted. David spent the first day reviewing documents, the second day walking the property, the third day comparing old coordinates against modern records. By the fourth afternoon, Eleanor knew something was wrong. The surveyor's demeanor had changed. He had become unusually quiet, focused, careful. The way people become when they discover something unexpected and want to make absolutely certain before speaking aloud. Late that afternoon, they stood together near the edge of the property. Ranger sat nearby watching them. The valley stretched below. A cold wind moved through the trees. David folded one map, then another. Finally, he looked at Eleanor, Mrs. Whitaker. The seriousness in his voice immediately tightened her stomach. "What is it?" He removed his glasses. "I checked everything 3 times." "Checked what?" "The surveys." A pause. "The old one is correct." Eleanor stared at him. "And the current one?" David looked back toward the property. "The current one isn't." For several seconds, she said nothing. The words didn't fully register. "What does that mean?" "It means somewhere along the way, decades ago, an error entered the county records." "What kind of error?" David opened one of the maps across the hood of his truck. His finger traced a boundary line, then moved farther into the forest. Much farther. Eleanor followed the movement. Her eyes widened. The area was enormous. "No." David nodded slowly. "Yes." She looked again, then again. The numbers seemed impossible. "How much land?" "Approximately 38 acres. The world suddenly felt very still. Wind moved through the trees. Somewhere in the distance a crow called. 38 acres. Forgotten. Missing. Removed from the legal description. She looked at David. "You're sure?" "As sure as I can be." The surveyor pointed toward the forested hills beyond the visible property line. "The land was never legally transferred. What happened to it?" "Nothing." The answer sounded absurd. David shrugged. "It was essentially lost inside a paperwork error." Eleanor stared at the forest. 38 acres, for decades. Hidden. The realization felt strangely familiar. A hidden room. Hidden journals. Now hidden land. Leonard Mercer had been trying to tell someone. The pieces were finally beginning to align. That evening, David reviewed his findings in detail. The mistake appeared to originate during a county record update nearly 3 decades earlier. One parcel description had been copied incorrectly. The revised document became official. Every subsequent record repeated the error. Nobody questioned it. Nobody noticed. Or perhaps nobody wanted to. By the time he finished explaining, darkness had settled outside. The house glowed warmly around them. Ranger slept beside the dining room table. David packed his documents, then hesitated. "There is something else." Eleanor looked up. "What?" The surveyor exchanged a glance with her. "You know about the development project?" "What project?" His expression immediately answered the question. She didn't, not yet. David sat back down. "There's a proposed resort development several miles outside town." The words landed heavily. "Large scale?" "Very." Eleanor remembered Leonard's journals. The property purchases. The land transfers. The concern. A chill moved through her. "Where?" David unfolded another map. His finger moved across the valley, then stopped. Directly adjacent to the forgotten acreage. Silence filled the room. Suddenly, 38 acres wasn't merely an interesting historical mistake. It mattered. A lot. David seemed reluctant to continue, but eventually he did. "If these records are confirmed, the land still belongs to the Mercer property." "The house." "Yes. Meaning me." "Meaning you." Neither spoke for several seconds. Outside, darkness covered the mountains. Inside, Eleanor felt the entire story shift again. The hidden room had revealed Leonard's investigation. Now the investigation had revealed something tangible, something valuable, something people might care about. A lot. After David left, Eleanor stood alone on the porch. The valley below was almost completely dark. Only a handful of lights glowed inside Blackridge. Ranger sat beside her, quiet, steady, the same way he always had. She looked toward the distant forest. Toward the land Leonard had spent years documenting. The land everyone seemed to have forgotten. Except Leonard, and now her. For 30 years the mistake had remained buried. 30 years. Yet somehow Leonard had known, and somehow he had believed someone would eventually uncover the truth. The question was no longer whether Leonard Mercer had been investigating something important. He had. The question now was who else knew. Because if the forgotten acreage was truly valuable, someone somewhere had benefited from people believing it didn't exist. And sooner or later, those people were going to learn that Eleanor Whitaker had found it. The realization followed her everywhere, into town, into the grocery store, into the quiet moments on the porch with Ranger, even into her sleep. Yet despite everything she had uncovered, one question refused to go away. The footsteps. The land mattered. Leonard's journals mattered. The hidden room mattered. But none of those things explained why Ranger still occasionally froze at the staircase, or why Eleanor still sometimes heard those slow movements overhead after sunset. The mystery that had drawn her into Leonard Mercer's story remained unresolved, and somehow it felt connected. Late October arrived. The forests around Blackridge exploded into color: amber, crimson, gold. The mountains looked as though they were burning beneath the afternoon sunlight. One evening, Eleanor sat in the living room reviewing survey documents while Ranger slept near the fireplace. The house felt calm, comfortable, almost normal. Then the German shepherd opened his eyes, instantly. His head lifted, his ears turned toward the ceiling. Eleanor froze. She knew that look. A few seconds later it came, creak, another, then another. Slow footsteps, crossing the second-floor hallway, exactly as before. Not louder, not softer. The same measured rhythm she had heard for weeks. Ranger stood. The fur along his neck rose slightly. Not fear, attention. Pure attention. Eleanor set down the documents. This time she wasn't frightened. She was annoyed. The mystery had lingered too long. "All right," she muttered. "Let's figure this out." She grabbed a flashlight. Ranger immediately followed. The dog moved ahead of her up the staircase, straight toward the same bedroom. The hidden room bedroom. The room where everything had begun. When they entered, the footsteps stopped, as always. Silence. The bedroom sat empty beneath the beam of her flashlight. The wardrobe remained pushed aside from where she had moved it weeks earlier. The hidden compartment door stood slightly ajar. Nothing unusual, nothing obvious. Yet Ranger wasn't focused on the hidden room anymore. His attention had shifted, upward, toward the ceiling. Eleanor followed his gaze. The attic. For several seconds she stared, then looked back at Ranger. The dog remained perfectly still, watching, listening. The answer seemed almost embarrassingly simple. She had searched every room, every closet, every wall, but she had never properly investigated the attic structure. The following morning she called Walter. The old carpenter arrived shortly after lunch. By then a cold wind had begun moving through the valley. Gray clouds drifted across the mountains. Walter listened carefully as Eleanor explained her suspicion. Then he nodded. "I've been wondering the same thing." "You have?" "The attic always bothered me." That immediately caught her attention. "What do you mean?" Walter looked toward the roofline. This house was modified several times over the years. Leonard did renovations? Some. Walter scratched his chin. But not all. Within an hour, the two of them stood inside the attic. The space smelled of dry wood and dust. Sunlight filtered through narrow vents beneath the roof. Old beams crossed overhead. The temperature felt noticeably cooler than the rest of the house. Ranger moved ahead of them, his nose working constantly. Walter carried a flashlight. The beam moved across rafters and support braces. At first, everything appeared ordinary, just an old attic. Then Walter stopped. "Huh." Eleanor turned. "What?" The old carpenter crouched beside a section of framing near the far end of the attic. His flashlight illuminated something unusual. A narrow opening between support beams, almost invisible unless viewed from the correct angle. Walter pushed aside several weathered boards. Behind them lay a passageway, not large, just wide enough for a person to move through. The discovery sent a chill through Eleanor. "Was that always here?" Walter shook his head. "I don't remember it." Carefully, they followed the hidden passage. It led deeper into the attic structure, past insulation, past old framing, toward the front section of the house. Then suddenly the space opened. Eleanor stopped, speechless. A small observation platform extended inside the upper portion of the roof. built decades earlier, perhaps longer. Windows overlooked the valley through concealed openings hidden behind decorative exterior trim. From outside, nobody would know the space existed. The view was extraordinary. Blackridge stretched below, the forests beyond, the distant mountains. Walter slowly turned in a circle. My God, dust covered everything. Yet the platform remained intact. A chair sat near one window, a small table beside it, shelves built into the wall. It felt like a secret study, a place someone had used often. Ranger suddenly moved toward the far corner. His tail stiffened. His nose focused on a rusted metal box tucked beneath the platform. The dog pawed once, then looked back at Eleanor, the now familiar signal. Look here. Walter helped pull the box free. Dust exploded into the air. The lid resisted at first, then opened. Inside lay several notebooks, a flashlight, old documents, and something neither of them expected, a cassette recorder. For a moment nobody spoke. Even Walter looked stunned. The recorder appeared old but well-preserved. A cassette tape remained inside. Eleanor stared at it, heart pounding. Do you think? Walter nodded slowly. I do. The recorder required fresh batteries. Walter drove into town, returned 40 minutes later, and together they carried the machine downstairs. The sun had already begun setting. Orange light filled the living room. Long shadows stretched across the floor. The atmosphere felt strangely solemn, as though the house itself understood what was about to happen. Eleanor inserted the batteries, pressed play. Static crackled through the speaker. For several seconds, only hiss filled the room. Then a voice emerged, older, calm, measured. Leonard Mercer. The sound sent a shiver through Eleanor, not because it was frightening, because it was real. After weeks of reading journals and studying records, she was finally hearing the man himself. If you're listening to this, a pause. I suppose circumstances unfolded the way I feared they might. The room became perfectly still. Even Ranger seemed attentive. Leonard continued. He explained everything, not dramatically, not emotionally, simply. Years earlier, he had discovered inconsistencies in local property records, timber company acquisitions, boundary changes, documents that didn't match older surveys. He had reported concerns, asked questions, requested investigations. Most were ignored. Some disappeared entirely. Then came the revelation. Leonard had not vanished, at least not in the way people believed. According to the recording, mounting pressure and repeated threats had convinced him to leave Blackridge temporarily while pursuing legal action through state agencies. He feared evidence might disappear, so he hid copies inside the house. The journals, the surveys, the documents, everything. Then tragedy struck. While traveling to meet investigators, Leonard suffered a severe medical emergency. Not violence, not murder, a sudden stroke. He survived briefly but never fully recovered. The legal process stalled, the evidence remained hidden, and over time rumors replaced facts. Walter sat silently, eyes fixed on the recorder. Eleanor felt something inside her loosen. Years of mystery. Years of speculation, years of whispers, and the truth was both simpler and sadder than anyone imagined. But Leonard wasn't finished. The recording continued. Near the end, his voice weakened, yet his final message remained clear. The records matter less than the truth. A cough, then silence, another breath. If someone finds this one day, a pause. Tell them I stayed because this town deserved better. The tape clicked, stopped. The room fell silent. Outside, dusk settled across the valley. For several moments, neither Eleanor nor Walter spoke. Eventually, the old carpenter removed his glasses. His eyes glistened slightly. I knew it. Eleanor looked at him. Knew what? Walter stared toward the window. That he didn't abandon us. The weight of those words settled heavily between them. The mystery of the footsteps had finally unraveled. The hidden passage, the observation platform, the aging beams. As temperatures changed each evening, sections of the attic framing shifted in sequence. The sounds traveled through the walls and ceiling. perfectly mimicking footsteps. A natural explanation, a simple explanation. Yet without the footsteps, none of this would have happened. Without them, Eleanor would never have found the hidden room, never discovered Leonard's journals, never uncovered the forgotten acreage, never found the recording. Ranger lifted his head and looked toward the staircase. For the first time, Eleanor noticed something different. That the dog wasn't listening anymore. He was resting. The tension that had accompanied him for weeks was gone. Completely, the answer had finally been found. Yet, as Eleanor looked at the recorder sitting on the coffee table, she understood something else. The footsteps had not been the real mystery. They had only been the doorway. The real mystery had always been Leonard Mercer. And now, at last, he had spoken. The recording changed everything. Not overnight, not dramatically, but in the steady, irreversible way truth changes things once it enters the open. Within a week, copies of Leonard's journals, maps, and recorded statement had been reviewed by attorneys, county officials, and historical researchers from Eugene. Walter helped organize the documents. David Hollister provided certified survey reports. And for the first time in decades, people began looking at Leonard Mercer's story through evidence instead of rumor. Blackridge reacted slowly at first, then all at once. Conversations that had remained buried for years resurfaced. Old memories emerged. Former county employees came forward with forgotten details. Retired surveyors shared records from personal archives. A local newspaper published an article titled, "The Man Who Never Abandoned Blackridge." The article spread far beyond the town. Then another followed, and another. Soon reporters began arriving. Not dozens, not enough to turn Blackridge into a spectacle, but enough that unfamiliar vehicles occasionally appeared outside the Victorian house. Most visitors were respectful. Many simply wanted to understand what had happened. They asked about Leonard, the journals, the hidden room, the attic platform, the forgotten acreage. Eleanor answered when she could. When she couldn't, she pointed them toward the documents. Because this was never about her. It was about finally allowing Leonard to tell his own story. Winter arrived early that year. Frost coated the hillside most mornings. The forests surrounding Blackridge turned dark and quiet beneath low clouds. Smoke rose from chimneys throughout town. The Victorian house felt warmer now, more alive. Walter visited regularly, sometimes to help with repairs, sometimes simply to sit on the porch with coffee. The hidden room had been carefully organized, the journals preserved, the attic platform cleaned but left untouched, as if the house itself deserved to remember. Then the pressure began. Not from reporters, not from historians, from developers. The first letter arrived in December. Professional, courteous, a request to discuss potential acquisition opportunities related to the newly identified acreage. Eleanor laughed when she read it. Then she placed it in a drawer. The second letter arrived 2 weeks later. The third included a formal offer. The numbers were significant. Far more money than Eleanor had ever possessed. Enough to completely change her life. Enough to tempt many people. Yet, every time she looked at the proposals, she thought about Leonard, about the journals, about the hidden room, about a man who spent years fighting to preserve something larger than himself. And every time she reached the same conclusion. No. The answer remained no. Eventually, the letters stopped, for a while. Then one afternoon, a black SUV appeared at the house. The man who stepped out introduced himself as Richard Halverson, well-dressed, confident, polished. The sort of person who rarely heard the word no. He spoke pleasantly, complimented the property, praised Eleanor's stewardship, mentioned economic development, community growth, investment opportunities. Eleanor listened patiently, then declined. The conversation remained civil. Yet as Richard drove away, she noticed something in his expression. Disappointment, not anger, not hostility, simply the realization that he wasn't getting what he wanted. The same realization she had seen many times before, years ago, in another life. Back when decisions about her future often seemed to belong to someone else. That evening she sat alone in the kitchen. Snowflakes drifted outside the windows. The house creaked softly around her. Ranger slept nearby. His muzzle now carried a little more gray than when she first adopted him years earlier. She smiled. Age was arriving for both of them, yet somehow neither seemed bothered by it. The phone rang. The sound startled her. Most calls now came from people connected to the Leonard Mercer story. She expected another reporter. Instead, she saw a name she hadn't expected. Michael, her son. For several seconds, she simply stared at the screen, then answered. Hello? A pause. Hi, Mom. The voice sounded familiar, yet distant, as if coming through years rather than miles. Neither spoke for a moment. The silence felt awkward, careful. I heard about everything. Of course he had. The story had spread far beyond Blackridge by now. I figured you might. Another pause, then. Sounds like you've been busy. Eleanor looked toward the window. Snow continued falling beyond the glass. Something like that. Michael laughed softly. The sound surprised her. She hadn't heard him laugh in a long time. For a few minutes they talked about ordinary things. Weather, the holidays, the house. Nothing important. Yet beneath the conversation another topic lingered. Waiting. Eventually Michael found it. I should have called sooner. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. There it was. Not an apology. Not exactly. But close enough to touch. Neither of them seemed certain how to proceed. The years between them felt crowded, filled with things said, things unsaid, misunderstandings that had hardened into distance. Michael cleared his throat. I wasn't very fair after Dad died. The words hung in the air, simple, uncomfortable, honest. Eleanor didn't answer immediately, because she realized something. For months she had imagined this conversation, imagined what she would say, how she would respond, what she would demand. Now that the moment had arrived, none of those prepared speeches mattered. The anger felt smaller than it once had, much smaller. I know, she said quietly. Silence, then, I'm sorry. Outside, snow continued falling. Inside, Ranger lifted his head, watching her, listening, the same way he always had. Eleanor looked around the kitchen, the old cabinets, the worn floor, the journals stacked carefully on a nearby shelf. Everything she had discovered since arriving. Everything she had survived before arriving. For years, she had measured herself through other people's approval. Harold's expectations, Michael's opinions, the judgments of strangers, the assumptions of people who looked at an older woman and saw limitation instead of possibility. Without realizing it, she had spent much of her life asking permission to matter. Leonard's story had changed that, not because he had taught her anything, because she recognized something familiar inside it. Both of them had been dismissed. Both of them had been underestimated. Both had continued anyway. The realization settled quietly inside her. Not dramatic, not triumphant, simply true. Michael spoke again. Maybe I could come visit sometime. Eleanor smiled, a small smile, the kind that appears before a person fully realizes it's there. I'd like that. When the call ended, she sat for a long time without moving, watching the snow, thinking, not about the past, about the future, a future that suddenly felt larger than it had only months earlier. The following weeks brought more developments. County officials officially corrected the property records. Historical reviews cleared Leonard Mercer of lingering suspicions surrounding his disappearance. His name appeared once again in town meetings, school records, local history projects. People spoke about him differently now, more accurately, more respectfully. And gradually Blackridge began reclaiming a piece of its own past. One afternoon, Walter arrived carrying a framed photograph. The image showed Leonard standing beside the elementary school nearly 40 years earlier. Younger, smiling, very much alive. Walter handed it to Eleanor, thought it belonged here. She studied the photograph. The man staring back no longer felt like a mystery. He felt familiar, almost like an old neighbor she had somehow come to know. Together they hung the picture in the hallway near the staircase. The same staircase Ranger had stared at night after night, the same staircase that had started everything. As evening approached, Walter prepared to leave. At the door he paused. "You know something?" "What?" The old carpenter glanced toward the photograph, then toward Eleanor. "You stopped looking for permission." The observation caught her off guard. Walter smiled. "About time." Then he walked outside into the fading light. Eleanor stood alone in the hallway, listening to the quiet house. The mystery was solved. The evidence had surfaced. The truth had finally been heard. Yet the greatest change wasn't happening in county offices or newspaper articles. It was happening inside her. And for the first time in years, she no longer felt the need to explain herself to anyone. Spring returned to Blackridge slowly. The snow retreated from the hillsides. The forests brightened. Creeks swollen with winter runoff rushed through the valleys below town. And high above it all, the old Victorian house stood quietly beneath clear Oregon skies. A year had passed since Eleanor Whitaker first drove up the winding road with Ranger beside her. A year since she had stood at the foot of the staircase while her German shepherd stared into darkness. A year since she had heard footsteps in a house everyone seemed determined to avoid. Now the property looked different, not restored into something new. Restored into what it had always been. The porch had been repaired. Fresh paint covered weather-worn sections of siding. The garden flourished beneath Walter's patient guidance. Lavender bordered the front walk. Wild roses climbed a trellis near the porch steps. The old apple tree behind the house produced blossoms for the first time in years. Visitors arrived almost every week, not crowds, nothing overwhelming. Teachers, history enthusiasts, former residents of Blackridge, families passing through the region, people curious about Leonard Mercer, people curious about the house, people curious about how an elderly widow and a German shepherd had uncovered a story an entire town had forgotten. Eleanor welcomed them all. The hidden room remained preserved. The journals carefully displayed inside protective cases. The attic platform remained exactly as it had been discovered. Even the cassette recorder sat inside a glass cabinet near Leonard's photograph. Walter had insisted on that. "That's the voice that brought him home," he had said, and nobody argued. One bright morning in May, Eleanor stood in the kitchen, arranging fresh flowers in a blue ceramic vase, when Ranger suddenly rose from his spot near the window. The movement caught her attention immediately. Old habits. For months she had learned to trust his instincts. The German shepherd walked to the front door, tail relaxed, ears forward, interested, not alarmed. A few seconds later a vehicle appeared at the end of the driveway. Eleanor smiled. Michael. Her son climbed out carrying a cardboard box. He looked uncertain, almost nervous, the way people look when they are trying to repair something fragile. Ranger reached him first. The dog accepted several scratches behind the ears before leading him toward the porch. "Looks like he still remembers me," Michael said. "He remembers everyone who gives him snacks." Michael laughed. The sound came easier now, more natural, less guarded. Inside the box were old family photographs. Pictures Eleanor thought had disappeared during the estate dispute years earlier. Harold standing beside a fishing boat. A young Michael holding a baseball glove. Family Christmas gatherings. Camping trips. Ordinary moments. The kind people overlook until enough time passes. For a long moment, Eleanor simply looked through them. No anger, no resentment, just memory. "I'm sorry it took me so long," Michael said quietly. She looked up. The sincerity in his face reminded her of the boy he had once been. Not the man who had disappointed her, not the stranger they had briefly become, just her son. "I know," she said. That was enough. Neither felt the need to say more. Some wounds heal through conversations. Others heal through time. This one needed both. As summer approached, Blackridge officially dedicated a historical marker honoring Leonard Mercer. The ceremony took place on a warm Saturday morning. Most of the town attended. Walter spoke briefly. A county historian spoke longer. Then Eleanor was invited to say a few words. Standing before familiar faces, she looked toward the Victorian house rising above the crowd. The same house people once called unlucky. The same house people once avoided. The same house that had nearly frightened her away. She thought about Leonard, about the journals, about the hidden room, about the attic platform, about the footsteps. Then she simply said, Leonard Mercer deserved to be remembered accurately. Nothing more. The crowd applauded, because everyone understood. Later that afternoon, Walter sat beside her on the porch. The ceremony was over. The visitors had left. The town had returned to its normal rhythm. The old carpenter watched Ranger sleeping beneath the shade of the porch swing. You know, Walter said, none of this would have happened without that dog. Eleanor smiled. No, it really wouldn't. Walter looked toward the upstairs windows. Funny thing. What? I spent years thinking that house was holding on to a secret. Eleanor followed his gaze. And, turns out it was holding on to a person. The comment lingered between them, a simple observation, yet somehow perfectly true. Leonard had never been the mystery. The mystery had been whether anyone would listen, whether anyone would care enough to keep looking, whether someone patient enough would eventually arrive, that someone had been Eleanor, though she never would have admitted it herself. Summer passed, then autumn. The Victorian house became woven into the life of Blackridge again. Children visited during school field trips. Researchers occasionally stopped by. Neighbors dropped off pies. Gardeners exchanged cuttings. The house was no longer isolated. It belonged to the town once more, and Eleanor belonged with it. One evening, nearly 18 months after her arrival, she sat alone on the porch while dusk settled across the valley. The air smelled faintly of cedar and damp earth. Crickets chirped beyond the garden. The mountains darkened against the fading sky. Ranger rested beside her chair, older now, a little slower, but still watching everything, still listening. The German shepherd lifted his head as lights appeared upstairs. Warm, golden light shining through the second-floor windows. The very windows that had once filled Eleanor with unease. The hallway beyond them, the bedroom, the attic, the hidden passage, every part of the mystery, now transformed into something familiar, something understood. She looked toward the illuminated windows, then toward the valley below. Blackridge's lights flickered on one by one, tiny points of warmth against the gathering darkness. For a long moment she simply sat there, breathing, listening, present. When she first arrived, she believed she was buying a cheap house, a last chance, a practical decision made out of necessity. What she actually found was something else entirely. A home, not because of the property, not because of the land, not because of the attention that followed, because it became the first place in years where she was fully herself. No explanations, no permission, no audience required. Beside her, Ranger shifted slightly and rested his head against her leg. Eleanor reached down and placed her hand on the familiar fur. The same dog who had stopped at the staircase. The same dog who had listened when nobody else did. The same dog who had refused to ignore what he couldn't understand. A faint smile touched her face. Above them, the upstairs windows glowed warmly against the evening sky. The hallway that once seemed haunted now held only silence. Comfortable silence. The kind that belongs inside a lived-in home. Leonard Mercer's name had been restored. His truth had survived. The forgotten acreage had been protected. The house had found its purpose again, and somehow so had she. As darkness settled over Blackridge, Eleanor remained on the porch a little longer. Not because she was waiting for anything, not because she feared anything, simply because she was content to be there. The house everyone avoided had become the place where two overlooked lives finally found their voice. one from the past, one from the present, and both, in their own way, had been waiting for someone patient enough to listen. One from the present, and both, in their own way, had been waiting for someone patient enough to listen. Eleanor sat there until the last color drained from the sky. The upstairs windows glowed softly above her. Not mysterious anymore, not frightening, just lived in. A year earlier, she had stood at the bottom of those stairs, feeling unwanted in more ways than one. Widowed, estranged from her son, nearly out of money, certain that most of her important days were already behind her. She thought she was buying a neglected house. What she never imagined was that the house had been waiting for her, too. Not because of the land, not because of the hidden records, not even because of Leonard Mercer, but because there was one thing she and Leonard shared. Both had been quietly dismissed, long before their stories were over. Ranger lifted his head and looked toward the second floor.
The same staircase, the same hallway, the same sound that has started everything. A human being would have ignored them, slammed them away, moved on. But a German Shepherd had done something similar. He listened, night after night, until someone finally followed. Eleanor rested her hand on Ranger's neck. The on door side and leaned against her leg. Somewhere inside the house would settle gently in the cooling air, a family shout, no longer footsteps, just a home breathing. And for the first time, Eleanor understood that being forgotten and being without value were never the same thing. Sometimes the child survived quietly, waiting in the hidden room, waiting in old journal, waiting in places everyone else stopped looking. And sometimes it arrives on four paws, staring at a staircase, refusing to let go. So before you leave tonight, think about this. In your own life, that child might still be waiting patiently for you to listen.